Hi guys, it's Dre2584. I started watching SpongeBob when I was just 4 or 5 years old. It has been the cartoon of my childhood ever since then. When I got older, I developed an interest for seeing people's ratings and rankings on what SpongeBob's best and worst episodes were, and seeing which ones were generally the most liked and most disliked. But what are my personal opinions? Even if you're a die-hard fan of a certain show, there may be some episodes you're not particularly fond of. In this video, I'll be sharing my favorite and my least favorite episodes of seasons 1 to 12 of SpongeBob SquarePants. I'm not doing season 13 because I haven't seen many of the episodes from that season. Some of you may be thinking that I'm a bit old for SpongeBob since I'm 18 years old, but it's still my childhood cartoon with many rewatchable episodes. Anyways, let's get started with this video.
My pick for the best episode of the first season goes to SB129. In this episode, Squidward accidentally locks himself in the freezer at the Krusty Krab restaurant for 2,000 years when he was trying to get away from SpongeBob. So he sees the future where everything is chrome. Squidward didn't like the future, so he went inside the Krusty Krab's time machine and traveled back to prehistoric times. But SpongeBob and Patrick, as cavemen, chased Squidward back to the time machine, where Squidward broke the lever, causing him to end up in an empty white space. Once Squidward escaped, he traveled back to the present when he begged the time machine that he wants to go back. When I saw this episode, it really interested me because I was into the evolution of the distant past and future at the time. I also thought it looked very cool when everything was chrome in the future. I greatly enjoyed the experience of watching the episode overall. My least favorite episode of the first season was The Chaperone. In this episode, Mr. Krabs' whale of a daughter, Pearl, had her prom date break up with her, so SpongeBob goes to the prom with her. In my opinion, this episode was overall forgettable. Since I was young when I watched this, I didn't really understand much about how a prom works, so nothing seemed to catch my interest while I was watching it, and it wasn't really my thing. One downside to the episode is that I've always had a sensitivity to noises, and cartoon characters crying with the intense sounds and exaggerated visuals has always been a sensory issue. Pearl's intense wailing at the beginning of the episode was unpleasant for me, and at one point, SpongeBob also has a crying fit during the prom. Overall, I wasn't much of a fan of this episode. My pick for the best episode of Season 2 goes to Band Geeks. A lot of people say this is the best episode of the series, and for a good reason. In this episode, Squidward brings Bikini Bottom together to form a band to perform at the Super Bowl halftime show, since his rival Squilliam's band couldn't perform. Squidward brings the Bikini Bottomites into a band class to teach them how to play their instruments. Everyone couldn't seem to play correctly, and they all got into a fight. But then SpongeBob made a touching speech that made them all go to the Super Bowl and do a great job. This is a great episode because it's well paced and it's filled with good jokes. The best part, though, was when Squidward's band performed Sweet Victory at the end at the Super Bowl. Everything about that ending of the episode was amazing, especially how Squidward won against his rival for once after all that he's been through. I even went through a time where I kept just watching that ending alone because of how great it made me feel. My least favorite episode of Season 2 is called Dumped. In this episode, SpongeBob's pet snail Gary ditched him and started clinging to his best friend Patrick. What I didn't like about this episode is how it's just nothing but sad, and not even in a way where it touches people's hearts or can make people relate. There's not much else to it but that. At the end, it was revealed that Gary was only clinging to Patrick because he had a cookie in his pocket that he wanted to take. There's another episode 2 seasons later where Gary runs away from SpongeBob and he tries to get him back. That's a better episode in my opinion because it's touching and doesn't have just a purely depressing theme like this one does. My favorite episode of Season 3 is Chocolate with Nuts. In this episode, SpongeBob and Patrick try to sell chocolate to people at their doors throughout the neighborhood to get money. I watched this episode with my mom before, and we both loved it. This is just a fantastic and iconic episode. It's filled with funny and rewatchable moments. The best part was when they went to the first guy's house and he kept screaming, "Chocolate!" like an absolute psychopath and started chasing SpongeBob and Patrick to buy all their chocolate. That was absolutely hilarious and quite possibly the funniest scene from any SpongeBob episode. They tried going to different houses, but it wasn't working. SpongeBob and Patrick. So they started lying to people. At one point, they told this old lady and her mother, who was so old that she was literally a skeleton, that if you rub the chocolate on your skin, you'll live forever. That was another funny part. Eventually, when the crazy lunatic that was screaming and chasing SpongeBob and Patrick for their chocolate caught them, he bought all of their chocolate. Overall, I would say this episode and Band Geeks are probably tied for being my favorite episode of the series. What's interesting is my least favorite episode of this season is the episode to come before this in season production order. It's called Party Pooper Pants. In this episode, SpongeBob hosts a house party and gets locked out of his house. That's all I really remember from it. You just feel frustrated for him as you watch it, and you don't even see much of the party. Then he realizes in the morning he left his keys under the mat by the door, which adds to the frustration of those watching it. This was one of the show's specials, as it was double in length from the usual 11 minutes. But for me, it wasn't that special of an episode. And plus, it's pretty ridiculous how at one point, SpongeBob got arrested for not inviting the police officers to his party when he got locked out of his house. Now, my favorite episode from Season 4 was another one of the show's specials, and this one was actually special for me. It's Dunces and Dragons. In this episode, SpongeBob and Patrick get stuck in medieval times. Something I enjoyed about the special is how all the visual themes in this episode were aesthetic. They give a strong vibe for medieval times. It was also cool seeing all the characters from that time and the different places they go into where they meet the characters. They also sang songs in this episode. Although the songs may not be the best, they add to the vibe this episode gives. I was a little older when I first watched this episode since it didn't air on cable television very often for some reason. When I did watch it, when I decided to play it on my TV, I really liked it for how creative and unique it is. Coincidentally, my least favorite episode of Season 4, like with Season 3, was the episode to come out in production order, the one before my favorite episode of the season. My least favorite episode of Season 4 was Funny Pants. Despite the name, I didn't find this episode funny at all. In this episode, Squidward makes a joke that has SpongeBob laughing obnoxiously nonstop throughout the whole episode. It was too much. Squidward was annoyed by it, so he made up something called a laugh box, and told SpongeBob he was going to break his from laughing too much if he didn't stop. That lie made SpongeBob believe he really broke it the next morning, so he had to deal with the scene of hearing him cry violently. The ending just makes no sense either. Squidward apparently breaks his own laugh box, even though he says it's not real, and SpongeBob lends half of his to him, making him laugh like SpongeBob. My favorite episode of the 5th season was The Two Faces of Squidward. In this episode, SpongeBob accidentally slams the door on Squidward's face at the Krusty Krab, which sent him to the hospital. As a result of the injury, Squidward became handsome. He became so handsome that people were fainting once they saw him. A crowd of people around town started huddling around Squidward and harassed him. It was funny seeing how crazy everyone was being. Squidward couldn't handle it anymore, so he forced SpongeBob to slam the door on his face again to make him go back to his old look. But that only made him turn even more handsome. So as you'd expect, the crowd starts going even crazier. But after Squidward hit his face on a pole, he got his old look back, and the crowd left. This episode remains in memory for me because it was charming to see both Squidward's handsome look and even more handsome look. It makes this episode have the humor that it has. My least favorite episode of the season is called Waiting. In this episode, SpongeBob stands by his mailbox to wait for a toy to be delivered into his mail. This episode is actually short. It's just 7 minutes long instead of 11 minutes. It's a good thing that it is because it's dull from start to finish, because he just stands there the whole time. There's hardly any entertainment value. SpongeBob was also being very rude to anyone whenever they passed by. But what really bothered me about this episode was when it got to the part when SpongeBob missed his birthday party. Patrick comes back and blindly eats SpongeBob's slice of cake, and what was his present? It was the fork. So SpongeBob starts wailing his eyes out, and I couldn't help but both find it annoying and feel bad at the same time. So it was a double negative feeling. Then SpongeBob gets his toy, and he thinks Patrick broke it when it did what it was supposed to do. And he's tried to start a fight with him. Whenever this episode came on, I was waiting for it to be over. Although normally, I just change the channel instead. Because it's not good at all. My pick for the best episode of Season 6 is going to be controversial, since many people consider it to be a terrible episode. It's Truth or Square. This episode is considered a TV movie, as it's double the length of a regular special and quadruple the length of a normal episode. This special was meant for SpongeBob's 10th anniversary. Although a lot of people would disagree with me on this, they did a nice job for this anniversary special. SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, and Mr. Krabs got trapped inside the freezer vent when they set up for the anniversary at the Krusty Krab. While they were in there, they showed flashbacks and some other interesting stuff. During this segment with Patchy the Pirate, we saw some celebrities on the show, and we saw some other cool things like an animation of what SpongeBob would look like in his cartoon long before the show started. To me, it felt like a nice experience for a TV movie, and I liked the uniqueness of it. My least favorite episode of Season 6 is Boating Buddies. In this episode, Squidward accidentally drives into a stop sign, so he has to take boating school with SpongeBob all over again in his class. Tell me that's not absolutely ridiculous. From that point forward, this episode just tortured Squidward for no reason, non-stop. It felt like the whole world was just against him. Squidward ended up getting beat by a big guy twice in the bathroom, leaving him to cast over his entire body. This leads into the worst part of the episode, which was the ending. They were taking the written driving test, and even though Squidward knew all the answers, he couldn't write anything because his hand was covered in a cast, so he failed the test. The episode ends with Squidward screaming his head off because he just can't take the stress anymore, and I just felt so horrible for him. I don't know what the writers were thinking when they wrote this. Making an episode of someone being tortured nonstop for no reason is not funny. It's just cruel and hurts to watch. This has also happened to Squidward far too many times before, but this had to be the cruelest episode of them all. My favorite episode of Season 7 goes to Enchanted Tiki Dreams. SpongeBob and Patrick felt bad for bothering Squidward so much, so they built a tiki world of paradise for him. It was satisfying to see Squidward having the time of his life for once. He was riding on a boat while having a drink as the tikis were singing to him. One day in 2013, not long after first watching this episode, I went to some kind of outdoor shop with my dad that had tikis there, and it reminded me of this episode. Overall, I like the chill vibe this episode gives. Unfortunately, Patrick accidentally set the tiki world on fire at the end of the episode, but Squidward happened to make his memory last by using his boat on a swing set to hit SpongeBob and Patrick with it. That was obviously mean of him to do that, but he still managed to find something remaining of it, and SpongeBob and Patrick were oblivious to what he was doing. Now here goes my least favorite episode of Season 7. Just gonna point out that almost every SpongeBob fan I know hates this episode with a burning passion, and many say it's the worst episode of the entire series. It's A Pal for Gary. I don't have much to say about this that hasn't already been said by a lot of people. SpongeBob gets a new pet, who he names Puffy Fluffy, so that Gary is not alone when SpongeBob's at work. Although he looks cute at first, he keeps making a gruesome expression at Gary while roaring loudly at him. Meanwhile, SpongeBob is ignorant to all of it. At night, he turns into this terrifying monster while chasing Gary and destroying the whole house. Poor Gary was helpless and couldn't do anything about it. It was hard to watch. SpongeBob wakes up and blames it all on Gary. The next scene is the absolute worst part. Gary's in Puffy Fluffy's mouth with his tongue wrapped around him, and SpongeBob literally tells Gary to put Puffy Fluffy down. Wow. What in the world was SpongeBob thinking? Saying that what SpongeBob said was stupid is an understatement would be an understatement in itself. It may be generic to say this episode sucks, but I can't disagree with that. My favorite episode of Season 8 goes to Frozen Face Off. This is one of the season specials. In this one, everyone in town goes on a worm sled race for $1 million, which was secretly set up by Plankton, who is Mr. Krabs' arch nemesis, to steal his secret formula while they were gone. I remember watching this episode for the first time, and it felt like a full-on adventure. It has a nice story, it's filled with action, and I like the visuals of everything. Everyone eventually runs into the abominable snow mollusk that try to eat them alive, which adds to the experience this episode gives us. That creature was used with stop motion, and it looks out of place for the cartoon style, but that's what makes it look awesome. Everything about this special in general made it an enjoyable experience. My least favorite episode of the season goes to Smooth Jazz at Bikini Bottom. My problem with this episode is similar to the one with my least favorite episode of Season 6, which I mentioned earlier. Once again, we've got an episode that tortures Squidward. Squidward has tickets to meet his idol, Kelpie G, who plays the clarinet like him. But Patrick eats his ticket, so he has to call to earn tickets. Only SpongeBob was a lucky winner, so both him and Squidward went, which already wasn't good, since Squidward has a one-sided hatred for SpongeBob. Then Patrick appeared out of nowhere and ate their backstage passes, so they got kicked out. Like I was saying before, episodes that are mean to Squidward when he did nothing wrong aren't cool, and it was Patrick's fault this time. My favorite Season 9 episode is Patrick the Game. Around the time this episode first aired, I was into the board game Monopoly. In this episode, Patrick creates his own board game that's similar to a Monopoly board and comes up with all the spaces that involve different actions. I saw the episode on an advertisement before it released, and it was an episode I was looking forward to seeing at the time. It wasn't only entertaining, but they also got the humor right. Squidward couldn't stop landing on the go-to-jail space. Although I normally don't like how mean the world is to Squidward, he kind of deserved it this time for being mean to Patrick, and it was also a funny gag. This episode also invented a joke that I played on people at school, where I make them play tic-tac, which is like tic-tac-toe, but there's only 2 rows and columns instead of 3. So I go first, which makes them lose with no chance of winning, and they got a kick out of that joke. My least favorite episode of the season was the Fishbowl. In this episode, Sandy does 3 science experiments with SpongeBob and Patrick. The problem with this episode is how Patrick was being selfish and greedy. At one point, Sandy did an experiment to trick Patrick by putting the same amount of ice cream in 2 different sized bowls. He couldn't tell which one he liked better, so he eats all the ice cream in both bowls and leaves none for SpongeBob. Patrick eventually started a fight with SpongeBob once Patrick made him so mad that he was literally steaming. It was unpleasant to see 2 best friends in the show being so hostile with each other. It always bothers me to see friends getting into fights with each other. The best episode of Season 10 in my opinion is Feral Friends. In this episode, an event that happens once every century on the show occurs, where Neptune's moon comes out. When this occurs, all the sea creatures turn into a more realistic version of whatever creature they are for 2 hours. While most of the characters turn into a harmless creature, Squidward ends up turning into a giant octopus that tries to eat everyone alive. Sandy is the only one who's unaffected by Neptune's moon, since she's a squirrel. But then Neptune's sun comes out at the end, when Sandy turns into a real squirrel trapped inside her helmet. I enjoyed the creativity in this episode, and it looked cool seeing all the realistic versions of the characters. My least favorite episode of the season was also my least favorite episode of the entire series, which is an unpopular opinion since this episode doesn't get that much hate. It's called Lost and Found. I try not to overuse the word hate because it's a strong and passionate word, And this is probably the only episode I would go as far as to say I hated it. And it's all because of one thing that completely ruined it. This little kid loses his toy at the Krusty Krab, and he cries in the most painfully obnoxious tone that I can even begin to imagine. It really triggered my autism when I watched it. It would be one thing if it was a one-time thing before SpongeBob went to look for his toy in the Lost and Found, but the episode keeps cutting back to it again and again when the watchers least expect it. I just cannot watch it. The crying in this episode is not just annoying, it's infuriating. That alone makes this the worst episode ever for me. My pick for the best episode of Season 11 is The Legend of Bikini Bottom. As you might expect from the title, this is a Halloween special. Instead of the usual cartoon animation, they use stop motion. They have done this in Season 8 with the Christmas special. This is an episode I need to watch again, but as far as I remember, I liked how they did a stop motion animation for a Halloween special, and it was cool to see what they did for it. At one point, SpongeBob and Patrick went on this spooky Halloween ride that SpongeBob loved, but Patrick was scared. I enjoyed that scene, especially the part where they go through a pinball machine. In general, what I like best about this episode is it fills me with the Halloween spirit. My least favorite episode of the season was Appointment TV. In this episode, SpongeBob wants to see a special for Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, but SpongeBob has tasks to help people out. I found this episode to be dull because it rehashes other episodes from previous seasons. I know it's not the first episode to do this, but I didn't realize it as much before with other episodes, since I was younger when I saw them and older when I watched this. And then SpongeBob's DVR gets caught on fire when he got home, making him miss the episode. So then SpongeBob has such a loud fit of crying that he wakes up the whole town, and then he becomes so depressed that he grows a gray beard. It was over-exaggerated too much, and you know I'm not a fan of obnoxious crying scenes in any show. So his friends set up a play for him that rehashed the episode he missed. It was nice of them, but the problem is it teaches kids that they should get their way after throwing a massive temper tantrum. In general, there wasn't really anything I liked about this episode, to be honest. Now, finally, we've got Season 12. My pick for the best episode is SpongeBob's Big Birthday Blowout. Doing a special where SpongeBob's birthday was an original idea that I never even thought of before it came out. This special is another TV movie, which means it's 44 minutes long. For SpongeBob's birthday, him and Patrick took a tour on the surface world, which I thought was cool. The best part of the episode was when the voice actors of each character played a part for where it shows them all acting like the character they voice, working at the Krusty Slab. And they all have similar names to the sea creature counterparts. It's like a parallel universe with humans. It was an episode I enjoyed watching overall. My least favorite episode of Season 12 was Pineapple RV. This is yet another episode where Squidward gets tortured. He tries to go on a vacation, but SpongeBob and Patrick keep sabotaging it by getting in his way. Squidward also gets brutally mauled by sea bears in this episode. In an episode from Season 3 known as the camping episode, Squidward also got attacked by sea bears, but it was karma for being the grouch he was in that episode towards SpongeBob and Patrick. But he did nothing to deserve it here, so you just feel worse for him. Luckily, he got back at SpongeBob and Patrick at the end of the episode by making a sea bear chase them by playing his clarinet loudly, which makes the episode a little better. But I still didn't like how it was another episode of SpongeBob and Patrick ruining his day. And that would be it. Some of the choices for the favorite section of each season were hard to choose. So I wanted to make a chart right here that displays my second favorite episode from each season just to give them a mention. And here they are. In case any of you SpongeBob fans are wondering, I have seen the 3 SpongeBob movies. I enjoyed the first 2, but the third one didn't interest me as much. Anyways, thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments if you have watched the show and you agreed or disagreed with any of my opinions. Bye, guys.